What's going on there? Screen. Okay, can folks at home hear me? Good, thank you. For some reason, my phone doesn't want to talk to Zoom today, so I'm just going to ignore that. And we're going to press on because it is time to start. So the battle plan today is to start talking about sound and the material in chapter 7. Which means I need to get my drawing pad because I want to draw some pictures. Are there questions about anything else before we start in on the sound stuff from chapter 7? Anybody have any questions about material from the earlier chapters? Anybody got anything? Going on. Okay, so I'm going to share my, oh, I should say, I forgot to say on Monday, the exams are all graded. The in-class and take-home parts are all graded. You should be able to see your grades on Canvas, and you should be able to see my comments on individual problems. That's sometimes hard for people to figure out how to find that information. If you're having trouble seeing sort of what I said about like problem 4 or whatever, definitely let me know and we can talk about how to find that. But all that information should be there on Canvas now. If you have questions about anything on the either the in-class or the take-home exam, definitely ask. And other than that, yay team. It went pretty well. There is a quiz that I posted last night on some chapter 7 stuff. And it's due Friday night. You get 3 attempts at it. So I would encourage you to like try it at least once before class on Friday and ask class questions in class on Friday. And we can spend time talking about that as much as people want to. So cool, questions, comments? Okay, so let's start talking about chapter 7. Now, in the earlier chapters where we've been doing pictures, we digitized the picture doing 2 particular things. So the first was we took the picture and we cut it up into discrete chunks, okay, which we called pixels. So we divided a continuous space of information about light and color into little boxes. And then each of those boxes we represented using 3 numbers, R, G, and B. How much red there was there, how much green there was there, and how much blue there was there. So that's how we converted pictures into a digital form that we could then do stuff with, okay? Now, we've got to do the same thing somehow with sound, okay? And it turns out it's actually very similar. So you have probably seen sound wave pictures before in your life. Amplitude, where you get like some sort of sound wavy kind of thing. And this represents the amplitude over time. And one way actually to think about this as a real life experience is speakers, okay, especially big speakers. The big speaker would be more circular than that, but details. So they usually have a magnet here, okay? Oh, magnet. And that magnet moves back and forth, which causes the cone, the larger round area, to move back and forth. And this graph is essentially the movement of the magnet back and forth. So when the graph is at the 0 point, the magnet is sitting at rest in the place that it would be if there was no power. And when the amplitude goes up, the magnet might go one direction, and when the amplitude goes down, it goes the other direction. And it doesn't really matter which direction. But the magnet literally moves back and forth. That causes the cone to vibrate, which causes there to be pressure waves in the air, which when those reach your eardrum, cause your eardrum to vibrate, which cause little bones in the inside of your head to vibrate, which cause little hairs in your head to vibrate, which causes your brain to think you're hearing music. And that's a complicated process in the same way that going from rods and cones in your eyes to your perception of the world visually is a complicated process. But the idea is still pretty simple. We move a magnet, we move the base of the cone back and forth, and we make sound. And a wave like this is actually telling you how to move the magnet. And that's literally what's physically happening. And you can really see that on big speakers. If you've ever been to a large concert where they have like really big stacks of speakers and you're willing to risk your hearing, because it's not a very safe thing to do, but to get close to those, you can actually feel the air moving. Like there is so much movement in the cone that it creates breeze off the face of the speaker. And this is really just a description of what's supposed to be happening to the magnet. And the same basic idea is happening in your earbuds and stuff. It's just that everything there is so small, you can't see it, and you certainly don't feel a breeze from it because the cone or diaphragm is very small. The amount of motion is a lot smaller because it's so much closer to your eardrum. It doesn't need to do a lot to be able to make a sound that you can hear. Whereas if you're trying to fill an orchestra hall, you need a lot more punch to get the same effect. Okay, so questions about the whole sound wave thing? There's a lot more in the book, but I think this is something most of you have seen before. So, but I'm happy to answer questions. Okay, so then the same idea, we do the same idea in sound space that we did in picture space, in that we choose a different color. Oh, come on, stop it. We take a sample. So this is a sample. And in the same way that a pixel is a discrete chunk of an image, a sample is a discrete chunk of the sound wave. So the sound wave's actually continuous. It has arbitrary resolution, up to the resolution of the tools we're using to record the sound wave, but that's not our problem. And so we're going to go in there and we're going to grab a specific chunk of it, okay? And we can have Lots of samples, okay? And each one, we're going to just represent as a single value. A single numeric value. That out of the way. A single numeric value that is the, you want to be very specific about it, average height of the graph at that point in time. Okay. So when we digitize music, and this is what happens if you like do a voice memo on your phone, or if you have some equipment at home that you use to capture sound or music, you are taking essentially a sound wave like this that's coming off the microphone. So the microphone does sort of the reverse of the speaker. The pressure waves in the air cause the cone or diaphragm in the microphone to vibrate, and that causes basically a magnet in the microphone to move back and forth, and the recording device is able to measure those movements and turn them into this wave. So microphone's just sort of reversing the process that a speaker performs. And it then takes sort of the average position at a given moment in time and turns that into a sample. Okay. Does that make sense? Questions? So a sample is like a pixel. Unlike a pixel where we have red, green, and blue, so we have 3 numbers attached to it. With a sound sample, there is just a single number, which is the amplitude at that point in time. Okay. Questions? I feel like Joseph has a question. No? I was hoping. Anybody got a question online? Okay, coolio. And so that's the basic idea of how we're going to represent sound digitally. So a sound wave is then just going to be a long list of numbers, where each number is a single sample. Okay? And so in the same way that we can loop over all the pixels in an image, we can loop over all the samples in a sound. And each one of them will be a number. We can do stuff to it. We can make it bigger, we can make it smaller, in the same way that we can manipulate the red, green, and blue in a pixel and make them bigger or smaller. We can do the same thing with samples. So it's actually super similar. It feels like it ought to be somehow radically different, perhaps, because hearing and seeing seem like very different activities. But in fact, it's very, very similar. If you kind of get what's been going on with the pictures, if anything, it's a little simpler in sound land, because instead of 3 things, RGB, for each item, each discrete chunk, we just have the one. We have the amplitude and nothing else. Okay. Now, there's a couple of questions about how many samples do we take and how do we represent what's the numeric range for the samples. So if we think about pixels, here we had the range 0 to 255 for R, G, and B, right? What's the range for a sample? So This is 8 bits. We used 8 bits per color. So we used 24 bits per pixel. In Soundland, we're going to use, so 8 bits is also 1 byte. In Soundland, we're going to use 2 bytes, which is 16 bits. And that's going to give us, I'm actually going to look it up rather than attempt to remember it, because these are not numbers I know off the top of my head. Where did those go? Oh, there we go. So that gives us a range of negative 32,768 to positive 32,767. So 16 bits gives us basically 64,000 values. And we don't want to have them all be positive like we did over here. In Pictureland, we could go from black to white, so 0 to 255. Here, we want to have both negative and positive values. So instead of having it go from like 0 to 64,000, we shift it so that it goes from minus 32,000 to positive 32,000. So that means we can represent a very large number of different values along this y-axis, right? We can go from minus 32,000 to positive 32,000. So we could have very fine detail in the height of the amplitude graph using 16 bits, okay? And we could talk about sort of and we should probably at some point, maybe next week, because I also want to do some sound stuff. So we should, or Friday, we can talk about it. But we should talk about the negative and this idea of 2's complement that's in the book, and why we get 768 on the negative side and 767 on the positive side. But I don't want to get bogged down in that now, because I want to actually be able to make some sounds and have us hear some stuff. So we'll just take it as magic that's given from somewhere, that this is how this ends up. Okay. So questions about that? And then the other piece is how many samples do we take? And in sort of most digital sound these days, we take 44,000 samples per second. So 1 second of music is going to have 44,000 samples, each of which is 2 bytes of data. So a second of music is going to be 88,000 bytes of data for 1 second of music, which is actually a fair bit of data. Like, you know, this is you can rack up a lot of data fast by recording at this quality level. The reason for the 44,000, which is discussed in the book some, is the human ear, most humans, and like this is one of these things where human beings vary a lot, as they do in so many other ways, but the typical human can hear from about 2,000 frequencies of about 2,000 hertz, which is 2,000 up and downy bits per second, up to about 20,000 uppy downy bits per second. And the higher the frequency, the more uppy downy bits per second, the higher the pitch. So really high pitched noises, sounds are going to be up closer to that 20,000 range, and really low pitched things are going to be down closer to the 2,000 range. You get below 2,000, we don't hear them anymore, typically. You might still be able to feel them, but you're probably not hearing them. And up above 20,000, we tend to not be able to hear it. Other species sometimes can, hence the idea of a dog whistle. The dog whistle makes a sound above 20,000 hertz that people can typically not hear, but dogs' hearing is able to hear that and recognize it. So you can use it to get the attention of a dog without annoying or alerting other people that happen to be in the area. So different animals have different hearing ranges. And in the same way, different animals have different vision abilities. We are trichromatic. Most humans, some humans are not trichromatic, hence color blindness. But most humans can respond to 3 different colors. There are animals that are quadchromatic. I'm not sure what the right word there is, but can have 4 different receptors. And many insects can actually see ultraviolet light, and we cannot. So it turns out a lot of flowers have patterns in them that are only visible in the ultraviolet because their target audience is bugs. And many insects can see in the ultraviolet range. And so they look way more interesting sometimes if you photograph them using a camera that can receive and record UV light, because then you see it more like an insect would. And you're like, whoa, there's all this cool stuff going on that we cannot see because we don't have UV receptors in our eyes. So, but most humans can hear from roughly 2,000 to 20,000 hertz. To record a sound, you need to take samples at least twice the frequency of the sound that you wish to capture. And one way to think about that is imagine that you've got some sine wave. And let's say you took a sample here, 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 and here. You're going to read that as just flat. You're going to miss all the movement because you didn't take enough samples. So you need to at least be getting samples here, 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 and here to be able to reconstruct some approximation of the original sound. And so as a rule, if you want to capture a 10,000 hertz frequency, 10,000 cycles per second frequency, you need to sample 20,000 times per second to be able to get that. And because most people peak out at 20,000, if we sample at 40,000 or higher, we're probably going to catch most of the information that human beings hear. And so this is basically 20,000 times 2 plus a little bit for good measure. There were, in fact, serious fights about whether, so CDs were the first digital music format widely used in the world. And they were developed in the 1980s. Before that, music was on LPs and cassettes, 8-track tapes if you had a car. And when CDs were first being developed, there were a lot of debates in the industry about what the right sampling rate should be. And there were people that wanted a higher sampling rate than 44,000 cycles per second because they thought that would provide better resolution. What ultimately settled the matter was the industry felt that if the CD could not hold about an hour's worth of music, they wouldn't be able to make money. And so they needed to be able to put an hour's worth of music on a single disc, or they felt they did, for it to be commercially viable. And 44,000 was about as high as they could go, given the CD technology of the time, and get an hour's worth of music on a disc. So that was where the compromise ended up. Subsequent technologies can now put way more information on a similar sized disc. Blu-ray is way more information than an old-fashioned audio CD, partly because of using multiple layers and partly because of having smaller bits of the disc to store a single bit of information. But at the time in the early 80s, this was the compromise that was reached. And so most digital music that you buy even though you're not buying it on CD for the most part anymore, or you're not even buying it in many cases, you're streaming it from someplace like Spotify, most of that is still recorded at 44,000 samples a second, because that's sort of where the industry sort of settled. There could be higher resolution stuff in some instances, but this is probably 44,000 cycles a second, and 16-bit sound is still the norm in the industry. And that's probably most of what you've ever heard has been recorded using these choices. So, okay, so that was a lot of information about sound and frequencies and samples and stuff. Are there any questions about any of that before we actually try to do something? Like make a sound, modify a sound, have a look at a sound? Okay. Zeke.
Does that mean that like most of like the data from like the video is sound?
So Zeke is asking if sound takes up so much space, is most of what's in a video, like on a Blu-ray, or if you stream something on Netflix, is most of that data sound rather than image? Is that? The answer is probably no. Images take up a lot of space too, because a high resolution image is a ton of pixels now. So like 1080p means that they're 1080 pixels across by, I think it's 800 down. I don't remember what the down is on that. But that's sort of about a million-ish pixels per frame. And each pixel is 3 bytes. So that's 3 million bytes per frame, right? So it's still a ton of detail. It's also complicated because, in fact, when you get stuff, it's not just raw pixels and raw samples. There's been some compression done. And we'll talk about movies more toward the end of the course. But one of the things that they do with motion, moving images, to reduce the amount of stuff you need to store, is they will let's take the first frame, and instead of recording all the pixels in the second frame, they'll record the pixels that are different. Because if I have a static shot of this room, most of this doesn't move. You know, your head's moving up and down a little bit. Joseph just blinked, right? So there are some things that need to be captured, but you know, the wall in the back, it's still the same. I don't need to be spending a lot of energy retransmitting the fact that the wall's still there and hasn't changed color, right? And so you can use that to significantly reduce the amount of information you have to transmit. And there are compression mechanisms for sound as well. You know, you've mostly never actually, you rarely, if ever, have had like raw sample files to play. You're usually playing things like MP3s, which are significantly compressing the amount of information using a variety of fancy math tricks that are outside the scope of this class, so we won't talk about it. But it makes it a little complicated to answer that question. But I would think that in general, in fact, the video is probably a bigger deal than the audio. But it gets more complicated, like on say a modern Blu-ray disc or a high quality stream, you might have like surround sound. So let's say you've got Dolby 5.1, you have the information now for 6 speakers, and each of those speakers is its own set of samples, right? And so you're really amplifying the amount of information that's in the audio portion of the program. But then there's also higher resolution video on a lot of this stuff. So it's complicated. It's the not very short answer that I gave you, but they both take up a lot of space, each in their own way. Does that make sense? Yeah. Cool. Other questions? That was a really good question. Questions at home? Joseph.
Right, so when you're presenting pixels, you make them small enough so that the human eye can see the pixels, right?
Right.
So the sound, because the individual samples, do you get them fast enough?
Yeah, so Joseph's question is, we make the pixel small enough that the human eye can't see that it's a pixel, like we just see sort of a continuous space of colors. Then the samples, the sort of flip side is, are the samples small enough that we can't hear them as individual pieces? And we're actually playing them. If we sampled at 44,000 samples a second, the system is playing them back at 44,000 samples a second. That's how fast we're moving the cone of the speaker, is we're modifying the position of the microphone 44,000 times a second. And that is fast enough that we just hear it as sound. We don't hear it as individual chunks. Okay? Did that answer the right? Yeah, so if we lower the sampling rate, we would start to hear artifacts. You'd start to have, instead of the perception that the sound is like a smooth wave like this, you would start to perceive it to be and that's going to sound different. Like that, if we play that through speakers, it's not going to sound the same as a smooth curve like this. So if our sampling rate is too low, we will hear artifacts. Absolutely. Now, one of the things the phone companies have taken advantage of for many years is that for you to understand spoken word, the brain's really good at filling in gaps in spoken word. And we can get away with really, really manipulating sound that is just meant to be people talking and reduce the sampling rate and the range of values that the samples can take. And you can get away with far fewer samples and a much smaller range of values and still have audio that people can understand. And this has been, well, it's not so much of a big deal now because networks are all focused on data rather, like nobody uses their phone to make phone calls, they use their phone to watch YouTube videos. And so the networks are all kind of tuned to high density data movement. But before that was true, and phones were still mostly people talking to each other, a lot of the phone infrastructure was designed to minimize the amount of data that had to be moved around so that you could still reconstruct it and get an understandable speaking voice. So especially like on intercontinental calls, you were in the United States making a phone call to France, say, and that's got to be carried across a cable that runs under the ocean, and those cables were expensive and had limited ability to carry information. The phone companies did a lot of compression on the voice on those kinds of calls. So people sounded weird, but they were still understandable. So you can play a lot of games with that stuff. But if you want music to sound good, right, then it's a different game. Or if you want the sound effects in your surround sound theater experience to sound good, it's a different game, right? You can't, it doesn't have the same effect if you've compressed and screwed with the sound a lot. So they don't do as much of that there. But yeah, we're cranking out an enormous number of samples per second. If you've got your phone and your headphones in and you're listening to music, your phone is driving the diaphragm in your headphones at a very high rate to give you a good quality sound experience. it's kind of remarkable. I mean, 44,000 samples a second, I have no concept of what that actually means. I say these words all the time, but that's a speed that is way beyond human, at least my comprehension, right? 44,000, cutting a second up into a slice that's 1/44,000th of a second is so tiny, right? I have just no sense of what that actually means in real life. But we have machines that do it all the time. And in fact, I mean, that's happening right now. The microphone on this laptop is picking up my voice, digitizing it, sending it in real time to everybody who's in this meeting, which includes people in China. And their computers are taking those samples, reconstructing them into speaker movement, and people are hearing my words halfway across the world, literally, in real time at like 44,000 samples a second, which is frankly just kind of amazing. I'm just saying, that's weird, right? If you had told somebody 150 years ago that we would be just sitting around as a matter of course doing such amazing things, they would have thought we'd lost our mind probably. So it's kind of remarkable. Kind of remarkable. Did that make sense? Cool. Other questions? Questions from people that are actually halfway around the world? Or people that are just here in town but participating online? Going? So let's go ahead and actually try to make some sound. Now, I think, so I'm going to stop sharing this, and I'm going to share my, okay, actually, before I do this, I want to so folks at home, I'm not entirely sure how to best share the sound from the laptop. So I'm going to try something. A possible outcome is you will not be able to hear me anymore. So I'm going to keep talking, and if you can't hear me, like wave, or I think you should still be able to speak up and be like, no, we can't hear you. But I'm going to try something, and we'll see if you can still hear me when I do this. So I'm going to go to advanced, and I'm going to say music or computer sound. Okay, so can you still hear me? I am in fact talking. Can you hear me at home? Oh, people hear me at home. Yay, thank you. That's a big win, because I was a little concerned that, and I think this means you'll be able to hear the Jess output pretty well when I do sound stuff in Jess. But again, that's the second experiment that we will try right now and find out, excuse me, what we want to do. So I'm going to say a sound, make sound, pick a file. So the media sources folder, which comes with the book, and that's available on Canvas. I've uploaded it on Canvas so you can get it from there, or you can go get it from the book website. It has a bunch of, oops, that. It has a bunch of sounds in it. And so we're gonna go ahead, we'll do the same one that's in the book for now. Come on, preamble. Yeah, there we go. So the sound files are all .wav, W-A-V files. And we can make sound in the same way that we call make picture. And we can either provide a file name, or we can do something like pick a file. And this will create a sound object. So if we type a sound, it tells us it's a sound file, what file it comes from, and it tells us how many samples there are. So there are 421,000 samples in this file. So that means this is going to be about 10 seconds long, because we have 44,000 samples a second 10 seconds would be 440,000 samples, and we get 421,000 samples. So this is a little less than 10,000 or 10 seconds. Oh, I'm not sharing the Jess. That is terrible. Thank you for pointing that out. Share Jess. I got so excited about sharing the, worrying about the audio part, I forgot to actually share Jess. Okay, so here's Jess. Thank you, Joseph, for pointing that out. So I did the make sound. That's very much like make picture is. And then if we see what the sound is, the sound has 421,110 samples. So this is a little less than 10 seconds worth of sound. Okay. Does that make sense? Now, we should be able to play the sound, which I think is just play, right? Play, just a little p, play, sound. Ah, what is it? Help, sound functions. I don't want blocking play. I think I just want play. Oh, it is just play. Why did that not work or come up for me? So if we say play a sound. So that was one of the authors reading the preamble to the United States Constitution. And could you hear that at home? Could I get a thumbs up if that worked at home? Oh, it was very quiet, but then other people are giving me a thumbs up. I wonder, so it's very quiet compared to my voice. Is that what you're saying, Darren?
I think the voice is come from the speaker, not the share with the computer.
Ah, so you think it came out of the speaker and then back in through the microphone of the computer?
Yeah.
Well, let me then just turn the volume of the laptop up. And let's actually, that's a pretty long sound, so let's grab a shorter sound. Make sound, pick a file. Play airplane. Was that a little better at home? Was the volume better there? Airplane. Or is that still pretty hard to hear? Okay. So that all I did was turn up the volume. I don't know why my phone didn't want to join the meeting today, but I'll make sure that I try to get my phone to work next time, and we'll see if the phone audio actually picks this up better. And you folks are only hearing, so the people in the room, you're only hearing it from this little speaker as well. So you can hear it, but it's probably not great. Is that correct? Zeke, can you hear it in the back? Okay, so turning the volume up was good. Okay, so play is like show, okay? And we can explore a sound in the same way that we can explore, oh, actually, let's see how many samples airplane is. Airplane's only 14,000 samples. It's less than a full second. So if we explore airplane, we can see, you can't, oh yeah, you can. This is the sound wave of him saying airplane. So if we, airplane. So this is air, and then there's a little gap, and then plane. So you can sort of see that happening. Airplane. And that little gap, which we don't really hear if you don't think about it, shows up quite clearly here in the graph. And you can zoom in so that you can see the graph in more detail. You can see it's not super smooth, definitely not a sine wave. Human voice has a lot of wiggle in it, which is vibrations caused by weird details of your vocal tract, your mouth, your tongue, your lips. Like there's all kinds of resonance. There's actually, especially if you're speaking loudly or singing loudly, there's like weird vibrations that happen in your skull bones that can affect the sound, your sinuses. I mean, all kinds of things can be going on there. You can select ranges to see things. You can click in particular places and see what the current value at this location is, minus 21,764. We click over here, it's 10,308. So we can sort of look around the sound and see what's going on. Like this is the quiet part, and we can see that the numbers are, 1,106, so they're much, much smaller. Now we get back into where it's noisy. Here we got minus 17,495. Okay? And we can play the selection. So if we wanted to just select this part, so this is sort of saying playing, right? It's a little hard to come out a little farther, might be clearer. So if we wanted to, in the same way that we can extract a piece out of an image, we can use this to extract pieces out of sound. So if we wanted Mark Guzdial saying plane, but not airplane, we actually have that here. We could extract this section of this sound, and we could create a new sound that's just him saying plane. And in the same way, we could say, let's go the other way, we can get him saying air. Oops, I got a little probably of the P. Oops. Yeah. We can take the sound apart. You could take, if you've got something long like the preamble, you could take individual words and rearrange them, right? In the same way that you could take a picture and rearrange components. So we can do a lot of stuff with this, in the same way that we can do a lot of stuff with pictures. Questions before you actually do some stuff? Questions at home? Okay, hearing none, pressing on. Okay, so we can look at the samples of a sound in the same way that we deal with pixels. It's a for loop. So we could say, for example, we'll do this increased volume example. And we could say for sample in get samples of sound. So this is basically the same as with pictures. With pictures, we said get pixels, and that gave us a sequence of the pixels, and we can loop over them. Here we can say get samples. It gives us a list of the samples. We can loop over them. It's really very similar. So if you kind of understood how the pixel stuff worked before, it's very, very similar here, and you should just be able to kind of roll forward with it, okay? And then in the same way that we had get red, get green, get blue, we now have get sample value of a sample. So when we had a pixel, we could get the red, the green, and the blue out of it. When we have a sample, we can get its value. Same idea. But instead of having three functions, get red, get green, get blue, we now just have one, which is get sample. And now we can set sample value in the same way that we could set red, set green, set blue to be a new value. So we can say value times 2. And now this is going to take every point in the sample and double its value, crank it up, okay? So it should make the thing louder. It won't change the pitch, the frequency, the speed with which things go up and down is going to stay the same. It's just when they go up, they'll go up more. And when they go down, they'll go down more. So it'll make the volume higher, but it won't change the pitch. Okay? So let's save that. CSci 1201, 2020, 10, and today is the 7th. Load. And let's increase volume. Airplane. Oh, I forgot to actually say which sample I was setting the value for. Add me. So in the same way that if you say set color on a pixel, you have to provide the pixel and the new color. Or if you set red on a pixel, you have to provide the pixel and the red amount. If you set a sample, you have to say which sample you're modifying and provide the value. So, right, gap to that. Now we'll try it again. Okay, play airplane. I don't know if you could actually tell that that was louder, but if we look at Explore, I think it will become clear that this goes up and actually reaches the top, and it did not do that before. And this area actually comes all the way to the bottom, and this was definitely smaller. And if we, actually, can I leave that open and increase volume again? Try playing it. And let's try exploring it. Yeah, we can. Cool. So I think we can. Oh no, we can only see one at a time. Well, I can see two at a time. So let me actually share the whole screen so you can see what I'm seeing. Okay, there, that's better. So on the left is after having increased the volume once, and on the right is after having increased the volume a second time. And we can see we've definitely made the spiky bits bigger. And you can see it also in the quiet areas. The quiet areas have become much more pronounced than they were before, okay? Let's just do it again because it's fun. Okay, right, and now we're getting very jaggedy compared to before, and we can just keep going. Now, at this point, the quality of the sound is really beginning to degrade. And there are two issues that have happened because we've cranked this up so much. One is we are no longer distinguishing between the highest highs and the lowest lows. The highest highs are all 32,767, and the lowest lows are all minus 32,768. So where there used to be variation, there now isn't any. And this is called clipping, where we've cranked it up so much that we've gone off the end of the values that we can actually see or hear. Sorry, neither of those. Beyond the values that we can represent with 16 bits of information. And so that's reducing the quality. It's still understandable, like it still is airplane when he says it, but it's definitely noisier than it was. And that's, like, this is the kind of thing that I was talking about for compressing phone call information. You might do things like this because you can use less information, but it's still audible. The other big thing is there's a lot more hiss and noise in the quiet parts, because what was very quiet here between the key parts of the speech have now been really cranked up. And so if there's background noise like an air handler or a fan or a car driving by or just his breathing, right, that now starts to become a significant part of what we hear because we've cranked up the whole thing so much that the noise has come up a lot as well. And some of this noise might also be random noise in the system of recording the sound. So these things are not perfect, and there are going to be artifacts of the way the diaphragm moves and blah, blah, blah. And those artifacts might be small enough to be not an issue initially, but if we crank everything up enough, then we can start to really hear those things. So, okay. Does that make sense? Questions? Now we could also decrease the volume. Sample in get sample sound value equals get sample value sample set sample value divided by 2.0. No, say 2 because that needs to be in. So basically the reverse of what we did when we increased the volume. And now if we decrease volume, still pretty loud because we sort of had it up pretty high. Let's decrease it a couple of more times. Now it's definitely quieter. If we look at it, it's gotten much smaller. So it had started here. That's where we were after increasing it several times. And now as we've divided it down, it's much quieter. Notice it's very flat now, which it had not been before. And that's because we flattened off the tops and the bottoms by clipping when we increased the volume multiple times, and you can't get that information back, right? Once you've sort of cranked it up to the max, that information, any information that's off the chart, as it were, is lost. And so when we made it quieter, the fact that we lost that information becomes very clear. And it's much noisier than it was. And there's a lot of hiss in here, even though we've sort of reduced it. But relative to the spoken part, the noise is now much louder because the noise, we didn't lose information because we didn't crank it up so much that we clipped that. So the noise is still there, but the spoken parts are more damaged by this process. And we could do this a couple more times and it'll become essentially inaudible. Try that. So it's really, really quiet now. And we can see that it's, you know, pretty close to flat. And we've lost information when we made it quieter. If we increase volume, a couple of times, let's play it. So it's pretty close to what it had been. That's actually probably fairly similar. I bet if we zoomed in enough, we could start to see some places where we lost a little information, but we didn't go down quite far enough that we really started to lose information. If we decrease the volume another few times, actually, if we look at, what do we want? So we're here, I think. No, we're here, I think. So the sample values are still in the around 4,000. So we would have to decrease the volume quite a few times. We decrease volume. Go crazy. Now it's very quiet. And if we increase volume, or airplane, no, it still is pretty similar. If you did this enough, you would start to get things would drop to zero. And once they get to zero, you can't get anything back out of them. So, but you would have to actually shrink it down more than I'm interested in sort of sitting here and doing in front of everybody. But if we change this divide by 2 to divide by 2000, you could pretty quickly like start losing information. And then increasing it wouldn't be able to bring that back in the same way that once we clipped through increasing, we can't get it back through decreasing. So you do have to be a little thoughtful about that, but you can definitely do a lot of fun things. So, questions? We have 4 minutes. Somebody asked a super clever question. Anybody? All pretty straightforward. So an example I want to do, but which we cannot do in the time that is left, is normalization. So, and normalization is a pretty common thing. And you actually get this in photographs as well, where you want to use as much of the range as possible. So here, we're not using a lot of the potential range, right? Most of the values that are available to us are never being used here. And this is a common thing. If you've got a sound recording, because of either the nature of the recording environment or the equipment that you use to make the recording, there might be a lot of space that you're not using. And taking advantage of that space will often provide better definition and a wider range of difference between loud and quiet areas, which can be nice, give sort of better resolution and richness to the sound. So essentially, in normalization, and we'll have to do this later because we don't have time to do the whole thing, but basically you have to go through and find the biggest amplitude that you've got and then multiply everything so that the biggest becomes the largest possible and everybody else grows accordingly. And that can give you a nicer sound experience. And that kind of thing is done a lot in music recording. We'll talk about that later. Any questions in the 1 minute that's left? Okay, thank you all very much. Friday we'll be online, not here in the room, although the number of people in the room is slowly shrinking. We're down to 3 today, after I think we were at 5 most of last week. So at some point it'll just be me sitting here by myself, and everybody will be online. Yeah, look at the quiz, and we'll talk about that on Friday, and we'll give you something to do with sounds on Friday. So talk to everybody later. Ciao.